Design in Nature, ? Scientific and Philosophical Perspectives. At the birth of Western civilization, one of the first things to grip the scientific and philosophical imagination of the human race was the astonishing order and beauty which nature displays. Against the materialists and the skeptics of their day, the greatest of the Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, were united by a set of shared convictions that the cosmos manifests a rational order, that the cosmos manifests a moral order, that the rational order and the moral order are, in some sense, the one and the same thing, and that the greatest this worldly good for humans is to come to understand, to live in harmony with, and perhaps to emulate that rational moral order. Plato's majestic exploration of these themes in the Timaeus is a landmark in the history of philosophy, but it was only one of many philosophical explorations of that great theme. Plotinus, Aquinas, the Cambridge Platonists, to name but a few, explored it in detail. Most famously, Kant affirmed something very like that theme, I think, when he wrote that the two things which filled him with awe were the starry sky above and the moral law within. As everyone knows, the quarrel between believers in intelligent design and believers in random evolutionary forces has been an enduring feature of Western philosophy, and the issues are still fiercely contested in contemporary Western academia and popular culture as well. The names and the faces may be different, but the great issues are strikingly similar. It is for these reasons that we decided to organize a conference with the grand title, Design in Nature, ? Scientific and Philosophical Perspectives. And I hope that you will all agree that this is, as I've suggested, one of the grand themes of the history of philosophy. Let me move on then to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Stephen Meyer. Stephen came to Cambridge University as a Rotary International Scholar and gained the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in 1991 for a thesis which offered a methodological interpretation of origin of life research. Having held tenured positions in American universities, he founded the Discovery Institute in Seattle, where he is now the director of the Center for Science and Culture. Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell, was a TLS Book of the Year and has been described as, I quote, a landmark in the intelligent design debate. His other publications include a contribution to and the editing of a peer-reviewed volume, Darwinism, Design and Public Education, and the textbook, Explore Evolution. So it gives me very great pleasure indeed to introduce Dr. Stephen Meyer, to give the first of the lectures this morning, and the title of his lecture is Intelligent Design, the Most Credible Idea, ?
It's a lot of fun for me to be at a Tyndale event. When I was a postgraduate student here, there weren't enough study carrels in the History and Philosophy of Science department where I was, and the warden of the Tyndale House at the time kindly offered me a study carrel. And one day he had some wealthy American donors walking through the library, and he wanted to show them that they had some American students in the library. So he decided that he would swing by the carrel where I worked to show me off and my office mate. And I had this bad habit of coming back from lunch and lying down underneath the desk and taking a little kip. And the warden, this was Bruce Winter from back in the day, And he loves to tell this story of coming around the corner and seeing these big American tennis shoes sticking out of the, and he quickly whisked the donor by without stopping. So anyway, it's great to be at a Tyndale event. The conference is focusing on the status of the design argument. I've been formulating a case for intelligent design in a specifically scientific context. And I think the case that I'm making, and that many of us in the ID research community are advancing, has larger philosophical and even theological implications. But today I want to focus on the more minimalist scientific case for intelligent design, the case for a designing agent of some kind, a design simpliciter, and then in the discussion perhaps we can explore the ramifications, the implication of that case for the status of the classical teleological argument, and specifically for whether or not a specifically theistic design argument is now possible. The design argument, the history, well, most of us would be familiar with the basic history of the design argument, but it was a very popular argument from the Greeks through the period of the scientific revolution up into the period of the Enlightenment. The design argument is said to have been refuted first by Hume and secondly by Darwin. And whether or not it was refuted by Hume is, I think, historically not so clear. Hume's basic problem with it was he claimed that it was an argument from analogy, and that arguments from analogy depend on the similarity of the effects that are being compared. The structure of an argument from analogy is that if you have similar effects and you know the cause in one case, you can infer that a similar cause was responsible in the other case. What Hume did to undermine the design argument was to cast doubt on the similarity of the effects, the similarity between the organic world, the living things, and mechanical objects. And the principal way in which he tried to cast doubt on that similarity was to point out that in the case of organic beings, living things, they were capable of self-replicating, of copying themselves. And so even at the time, people, well, does that really undermine the case, or does it perhaps even strengthen the case for design in that living things seem to have a capacity that is more elegant, more sophisticated, more complex than mechanical entities? In any case, Hume is said to have refuted the design argument in the philosophical circles, but I don't think that's actually true, because he did this amazing trick of refuting Paley's design argument before Paley wrote in 1802, Hume died in 1779, and somehow he was said to have refuted that argument. So Paley clearly had a lot of impact on the 19th century, and the design argument I don't think was dead. What really put it to rest, or at least for a period of time, was the work of Darwin. It wasn't so much that it was a failed analogy, it was that Darwin came along and provided what seemed to many people a better explanation for the phenomenon, where the phenomenon was defined as the appearance of design. And this was the classical Darwinian formulation. Life looks as if it were designed for a purpose, but it's not really designed, because there is a purely unguided, undirected process that can do the work that heretofore we thought only intelligent agents can do. And this was the force of Darwin's argument in the 3rd chapter of The Origin, where he showed that natural selection, the mechanism of natural selection, could explain the key appearance of design that attracted the fascination of 19th century biologists, which was adaptation. Birds live in the air, they have wings that allow them to live in that environment. Fish live in the water, they have gills and fins. And so the adaptation, the fitness of an organism to its environment seemed to be a powerful argument for design in the 19th century until Darwin. And what Darwin attempted to do with the idea of natural selection was to show that nature could produce the adaptations. And he used his famous analogy to breeding experiments to convey that point. Human breeders can make a woollier breed of sheep by selecting the woolliest males and females only to breed over a period of time. Darwin said, hey, couldn't something like a series of very cold winters produce the same effect? That nature could produce adaptation to an environment. And so in the history of the design argument, I think it's much more been the case that Darwin has provided the decisive blow, or at least until recently. And that's what I want to talk about today, is really the return of the design argument as a scientifically based explanation for some of the key features of living systems. Here's Francisco Ayala, past president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's very clear about Darwin's decisive role in the refutation of the classical design argument. He says it was Darwin's greatest accomplishment to show that the directive organization of living things can be explained as the result of a natural process, natural selection, without any need to resort to a creator or any other external agent. Dawkins picks up this same idea. This isn't just Dawkins and his very extreme new atheism. This is classical and classical neo-Darwinian thought. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Key word, of course, for all good Darwinians is the word appearance. They define the effect, the explanandum, the thing to be explained, as the appearance of design. So notice how design is right in the center of the biological debate, right to the present day. But the appearance of design, according to the neo-Darwinians and according to Darwin himself, is something that can be explained away because there is an undirected, unguided process, namely natural selection acting on random variations or mutations, which can produce the appearance of design without the process being designed or guided in any way. So it's a process that mimics the powers of a designing intelligence, but which is itself completely mindless. And Darwin himself clarified this in some of the letters that he wrote after the writing of The Origin, where he says there's no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course in which the wind blows. The whole point of my theory is that the mechanism is undirected. It does what we thought only the intelligent agent could do, the intelligent breeder could do, but it does it mindlessly. And in providing what has seemed to many biologists for quite some time to be a completely adequate explanation, not only of the appearance of design, but the appearance of complex new forms which manifest design, Darwin has been said to have refuted the design argument. Now, what I want to ask today is whether or not that's actually true. And I want to ask that by framing the question in a very specific way. Darwin attempted in the 19th century to account for the origin of adaptation. And most of the examples he offered were rather minor things, like sheep becoming woollier over time, or finch beaks getting longer or shorter, that kind of thing. But the question I want to ask is adaptation, especially minor adaptation of the kind that Darwin accounted for, the only appearance of design in nature? And if not, has natural selection explained away all other appearances of design? Now that question has come to the fore in biology recently in a very acute manner. Some of you may know that there is a group, there are quite a number now of evolutionary biologists calling for a new theory of evolution. There's a group called the Altenberg 16. They're saying we need a new theory of evolution because natural selection acting on random mutations simply does not have the creative power long attributed to it. In particular, it has a very hard time, we have a very hard time using that mechanism to explain the origin of fundamentally new forms of life. We might be able to explain why finch beaks get longer or shorter in the Galapagos, or peppered moths change the frequency of expression of certain genes from a dark-dominated to a light-dominated population, but we're having a real hard time explaining where we get moths or birds in the first place. The origin of body plans is a huge problem in evolutionary biology. And a number of leading evolutionary biologists are now calling for a new theory of biological evolution because the Darwinian mechanism doesn't seem to have the creative power attributed to it, which at the very least, I think even in the area of biological evolution, opens up the question of design all over again. I want to just footnote that and make a note of that, the reality of that discussion that's going on in evolutionary biology now. But I want to move to an even more fundamental question, and ask: did Darwin really eliminate the case for design in biology? And to put this in context, I want to put up Darwin's famous depiction of the history of life. This is actually, I think Haeckel did this particular drawing of the tree of life. But this represents Darwin's understanding of the history of life. The vertical axis is the time axis. The horizontal
represents changes in form, and the branches represent all the forms of life that exist today, and the trunk of the tree represents the very first life form. And most of you probably know that Darwin did not attempt to explain the origin of life. It wasn't something that he tried to take on. This isn't a criticism of his theory. It was just beyond the scope of it. So if we think of evolutionary theory today, we have to think of two distinct branches of evolutionary theory. Biological evolution attempts to account for the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms going back to this very first form. Chemical evolutionary theory attempts to explain the origin of the first life from simpler non-living chemicals. And what I want to do today to get the question of design back on the table is consider the question of the origin of life itself. Because if Darwin really succeeded in providing a comprehensive explanation for all of the features, the design-like features of the living world, but did not address this, the origin of the first life, it's at least possible that there may be features of the simplest forms of life that give evidence not just of apparent design, but of actual design. And so that's the possibility I want to consider this morning. I'm not precluding the idea that there may be evidence of design further along the timeline. If we put this in perspective, we could think of possible loci of design, possible places in the unfolding of the cosmos where you might see evidence of design. You might think of that on a timeline. There may be evidence of design at the very beginning of the universe in the so-called fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics and of the initial conditions of the universe. There may be evidence of design in the origin of animals or the origin of higher forms of life, the kinds of things that Darwin attempted to explain. And that is certainly a possibility, I think, again, because so many biologists are recognizing there are limits to the creative power of natural selection, and therefore that mechanism may not have explained everything that people have assumed over the last 150 years. But I'm focusing in the argument that I'm sketching today on this crucial question of the origin of life itself, the very first life, somewhere between the beginning of the universe and the origin of the higher forms of life. Might there be evidence of design in the very first organisms, the very first cells that arose on planet Earth? Now, in the 19th century, scientists, the evolutionary scientists, didn't worry about this question very much. It's a little bit of an historical oddity if you think about it, because there's been such a dogmatic assertion that Darwin did refute the design argument on the one hand, and on the other hand, the very clear acknowledgement that he did not explain the origin of the first life. So why were people so confident that design had been completely eliminated from biology if there was this huge, gaping, and important, fundamentally important problem that had not been explained by an undirected, unguided, materialistic process? Well, as I got into that subject in my own study, one of the things I found was the main reason for that confidence in the 19th century was the view of the cell that scientists held at the time. The very simplistic understanding of the cell, in fact. And I love this quote from Haeckel, and there's a similar one from T.H. Huxley. Haeckel says that the cell is a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm, something like gooey jello, no structure. And when scientists in the late 19th century conceived of life as a simple entity made of this simple chemical, they called it the protoplasmic substance. When they conceived of it as something very chemically simple, it was easy to imagine that with just a couple steps you could produce something like a couple chemical interactions, simple chemical interactions, you could produce the protoplasmic substance, which was the essence of life. And so while there wasn't a formal theory of the origin of life, it was assumed that that was not going to be a very hard thing to produce. Now, as scientists began to get a more sophisticated understanding of the complexity of the cell, by the 1920s and 30s, a more sophisticated theory of chemical evolution was proposed, in particular by the Russian scientist A.I. Oparin. And he developed a theory in the early 20s and then developed it further in the 1930s. It was very much modeled after a Darwinian approach to things, but he had a whole lot of chemical steps, getting from the simple, the simplest kind of chemicals in the atmospheric gases to more complex compounds like hydrocarbons, and then finally to amino acids, and then he had some ideas about all those chemicals becoming enclosed in a cell. Now, that idea became the kind of orthodoxy in evolutionary theory for quite a long time, but it came under pressure as well in the 1950s and 60s with the molecular biological revolution. The complexity that was revealed at that time outstripped even this more complicated evolutionary model that Oparin developed, involving many steps and millions of years, many hundreds of millions of years. And obviously one of the first key discoveries in the 1950s was the discovery by Watson and Crick of the structure of the DNA molecule, the elucidation of the molecule. And soon after, the understanding that was proposed first by Crick of what he called the sequence hypothesis. The DNA was not just an elegant molecule in terms of its structure, but DNA was actually storing digital information, or information in digital form. This was his sequence hypothesis, in which he proposed that along the spine of the DNA molecule, on the interior of the spine, the four chemicals called the bases, the nucleotide bases, are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text or digital characters in a section of machine code. That is to say, it's not the chemical shape of these or properties of these nucleotide bases, it's their arrangement according to the specifications of a code which allows them to perform the function that they perform in the living organism, which is in fact to convey instructions for building the proteins and protein machines that cells need to stay alive. So in DNA, Watson and Crick elucidated not just an elegant chemical structure, but in fact a molecule that was capable of carrying information. Now Dawkins later said of this, Richard Dawkins of neo-Darwinian fame, said that the DNA was or is a remarkable in its computer-like character. That it is clearly, it conveys an appearance of design. The presence of digital information is a striking appearance of design, says Dawkins. Now, just so we have a little, I know we've got a mixed audience of philosophers and theologians and scientists, and I want to give just a little bit of a description of the way that DNA works and the importance. So we have a common understanding of the importance of the information that's present in DNA and why it has become such a centrally important question for scientists attempting to explain the origin of life itself. If you're trying to explain the origin of life, you have to explain the origin of the simplest cells as we find them, because eventually those cells had to arise on Earth. So if inside life we find not just simple protoplasmic goo, but instead a complex information processing system and sophisticated molecules capable of storing digital information, if you want to explain life as we find it, we have to explain that. We have to explain the origin of the features of life as we find it, and we now know that those features are informational. We have a complex information processing system processing digital information stored in DNA and transmitted through RNA. And I want to just give a little sketch of this so we have a clear idea of what really needs to be explained by scientists trying to account for the origin of life. DNA stores information, but the information in DNA is crucially important for arranging what are called amino acids, and the amino acids are the building blocks of larger molecules in the cell called proteins. And the proteins you can think of as the workhorses or the toolbox of the cell. The protein molecules perform all the important jobs. They process information, they form structural parts of larger molecular structures and machines. They catalyze important reactions at rates much, much faster than would happen in their absence. So they're in a sense, the toolbox. Here's a visual illustration. I stole these once when my children were little. They're called snap-lock beads. I don't know if you have them in this country. But anyway, each one of these beads represents an amino acid. And the trick about proteins is that if the amino acids are arranged, sequenced properly, then it will set up a constellation of interacting forces that will cause the chain to fold into a specific three-dimensional shape. If the shape is correct, then the protein can perform a very specific job. Proteins perform the jobs that they do in virtue of a precise three-dimensional fit. So for example, we have a protein here whose job it is to break apart a two-part sugar molecule, a disaccharide. And you can see the sugars are the little barbell-shaped guys at the top, and you can see how they nestle into the grooves of the enzyme protein. This protein performs an enzymatic function. And because of the precise fit, that causes or allows a chemical reaction to go forward much more quickly than it would otherwise do. And it's that precise three-dimensional fit that allows the protein to do the job, the hand-in-glove fit. Now, the proteins acquire that three-dimensional fit because of the one-dimensional sequence specificity of the arrangement of the amino acids. Okay, so if the amino acids are arranged properly, then you get the chain to fold into a particular three-dimensional conformation or form or structure. If they're not arranged correctly, let's say we've got these two guys, the green one and the purple one, out of order, the chain may simply lie limp and not fold, not form a three-dimensional structure that's capable of doing a job. So you have this kind of flow chart of, it's a kind of logical flow. You have first three features of proteins. The shapes perform the functions, the folded chains form the shape, and the precise arrangement of the amino acids determines the folding and therefore the function. So at bottom, the key is to get these guys arranged properly so that the molecule folds properly so that it can do the job, the various jobs that cells need to survive. So you've got this kind of flow. The proteins display sequence specificity, which is necessary to the folded three-dimensional structure of the molecules, but that raises the question, where does that specificity come from? And that's what Crick anticipated brilliantly in 1957. Before there was evidence of this, he intuited, and interestingly, he was a code breaker in World War II. And in the history of the molecular biological revolution, I think that obviously the great discovery of the double helix structure was a huge breakthrough. But to me, the more important things came a few years later with the sequence hypothesis, with Crick's understanding of what transfer RNA does. And he anticipated a lot of this on the basis of functional and logical requirements of information transfer, having been a code breaker. And so what he anticipated turned out to be correct, and that is that the specificity of arrangement of the amino acids, and each one of these guys represents an amino acid with a different side chain coming off of the common backbone. The arrangement of those chemicals is determined by the sequence specificity, the prior specificity of arrangement of the bases on the DNA. In other words, the information on DNA directs the construction of these protein molecules by making sure that the amino acids are linked correctly in this beautiful sequence. So it's information stored in a digital form directing the construction of amino acids, which then causes the beautiful folding, which then allows the molecules to perform a function. But at root, at bottom, what has to be accounted for is this information. Where does that come from? Okay? Now I've got a little animation clip. Let me just run it and I'll give you a little narrative of my own here. This animation shows how the digital information in the DNA molecule directs the construction of proteins during what's called gene expression or protein synthesis. So you have the double helix, the information-bearing units are highlighted with the A's, T's, G's, and C's. And then we have you see the double helix is a big protein complex called a polymerase, which copies the information on the DNA molecule. We're seeing the inside of the polymerase, the double strands being separated. A copy of one of the strands is being produced called a messenger RNA. That guy is you're going to see that in just a minute, coming out of the polymerase molecule. There it spits it out. That's going to be then transmitted out into the outer cytoplasm, and it will go through what's called a nuclear pore complex. It's a molecular machine that is involved in information recognition. There's a postal code on the end of that. If it's the right code, the nuclear pore complex opens up, and then this will go out to the ribosome, which is the place of protein synthesis. It's a two-part chemical factory. This copy of the genetic instructions is going to be threaded through, and then there's a beautiful mechanical process that ensues where the information on the single strand at the top is then going to meet up with some adapter molecules called transfer RNAs. They're going to have complementary triplets of bases, and those triplets will carry specific amino acids matching up to the assembly instructions on that initial stretch of messenger RNA. So this is a picture, just really a cartoon picture of one of the central processes of information transmission in the cell, and it's a picture of what the simple cell looks like today. But again, it's really only a cartoon. And this is the protein as it's come off, goes into another protein, which helps it fold into its structure so it can do a proper job. Okay, so when we encounter this level of complexity in the cell, it raises a problem that I like to call the DNA enigma. The DNA enigma is not the structure of DNA. That's what Watson and Crick discerned in 1953. It's not where the biological information that is used in constructing proteins resides. That was elucidated in the years following Crick's sequence hypothesis during the early 60s. It's not even what the information does. We have a pretty good idea of that. The animation I just showed conveys that. The DNA enigma is essentially the problem of the ultimate origin of the information that is necessary to this whole process. And many origin of life biologists, biochemists, working on the problem of explaining the origin of life by reference to a chemical evolutionary theory have zeroed in on this problem as central to the problem of the origin of life. The two problems are essentially indistinguishable. Here's Bernd Olaf Kuppers, a leading German biochemist who works on the origin of life. He says the problem of the origin of life is clearly, basically equivalent to the problem of biological information. If you want to have, you think of it, I often with students will say, if you want to get your computer to perform a new function, what do you have to provide it? And they very quickly get the answer. You've got to have code. The same thing is true in life. If you want to build a new form of life from simpler pre-existing chemicals, the chemicals have to be arranged in very specific ways, information-rich ways, in order to produce the kinds of structures and processes that we have in actual living cells. You need information to build life. You want to build a new form of life from a simpler pre-existing form. In biological evolution, you also encounter an information problem, which is one of the reasons that even neo-Darwinian biological evolutionary theory is now under pressure. In any case, this is the key question for the origin of life. This is, in philosophical jargon, the explanandum, the crucial thing that needs to be explained. And as I mentioned, one point of clarification, then we'll get into looking at some of the competing explanations for this key problem. When we're talking about information, we're talking about, there are two different senses of that, at least, that we could be talking about. I want to make a clarifying point about the kind of information that we're talking about in a biological system. In standard or classical information theory, as proposed by Claude Shannon in the late 1940s, the idea of information was closely related to the idea of improbability. The more improbable a sequence or a string of characters, the more information carrying capacity the sequence had. Information and probability were inversely related. And he did it with famous log functions of various kinds. But when we're talking about information in a biological sense, we're talking about a richer sense of information than just the mathematical sense of Claude Shannon. Where in Shannon's theory, both of these two strings have an equivalent amount of information. Shannon's idea was that that information was a measure of the uncertainty reduced by a string of characters. Once a character is fixed, all uncertainty about the other possibilities has been eliminated. So in the top sequence and in the bottom sequence, you have an equivalent amount of Shannon information. They're both equi-improbable. But clearly, the bottom string has a qualitative difference to the top string that we can recognize. The bottom string has a property, I've been referring to it as sequence specificity. Sometimes it's called specified complexity. The idea is that the sequence matters to the function of the whole. The arrangement matters to the function of the whole. If something is sequence specific, the arrangement of the individual parts is crucially important to the function of the whole string. And so there's some terminology here, but if you think of Shannon information as a measure of improbability, and improbability as equivalent to complexity, the top string is complex. It's highly improbable. But the bottom string has is also improbable. Therefore, it's also complex. But in the case of the bottom string, the arrangement is critical to the function of the whole. And so we say it's specified. The arrangement is specified by reference to independent functional requirements, requirements of grammar in this case, or communication. Okay? Now, when we're talking about information in a biological context, we are not talking about merely Shannon information, not merely an improbable arrangement of things, but rather an improbable arrangement that is also specified by reference to independent functional requirements. And Crick himself was very clear about this right from the beginning of the molecular biological revolution. This is a quote from 1958. He's writing in the immediate wake of the formulation of Shannon's information theory. He's aware of the Shannon information theoretic concepts. And he says, yeah, there's Shannon information. It's a highly improbable string, but it's something more than merely Shannon information. It's Shannon plus specificity. Specificity that is necessary to function. So he says this, he says, by information I mean the specification of the amino acid sequence in the protein and the precise determination of sequence, either in the bases in the DNA or in the amino acids of the protein. For these molecules to perform their function, the constitutive parts have to be precisely arranged. And that arrangement is crucial. And it also underscores the kind of information we're talking about. So in the discussion of the origin of life, a crucial piece of terminology arose, in a sense, by necessity to describe the thing that really needed to be explained. And it was first proposed by Leslie Orgel. He called it specified complexity, and that's a term that I'll use today. We could also think of it as functional information or specified information, where all these things are synonyms for Shannon measures of complexity plus this qualitative feature of specificity of arrangement. Now, sometimes people have, one of the critiques of the book Signature in the Cell was that Meyer and these ID proponents have used an idiosyncratic creationist definition of information. I think what I've shown already is that that's not the case. This distinction between Shannon information and functionally specified arrangements, functional information, specified arrangement, specified complexity, whatever term you want to use, is crucial to understanding what needs to be explained in the origin of life. And the distinction came out of origin of life studies from standard mainstream people. Leslie Orgel said this. He said, living things are distinguished by their specified complexity. Crystals fail to qualify because they lack complexity. Crystals have just a repetitive order, the same thing over and over again, kind of like a mantra. Mixtures of random polymers fail to qualify because they lack specificity. So this is what needs to be explained. The kind of information that needs to be explained is functionally specified information or specified complexity. And here, again, Dawkins acknowledges that when we're talking about that kind of information, functional digital code, if you will, we're talking about something that is uncannily computer-like and therefore portrays or conveys, or displays rather, a striking appearance of design. Okay. That's the first half of the talk. That describes what needs to be explained. What I want to do now is talk about some of the main categories of competing explanations, and then talk about the logical structure of the case for design that I've laid out. I've developed the case for intelligent design as what's called an inference to the best explanation. And I was influenced in that, in formulating the case in that way for a couple of reasons. First of all, as I began to study the works of the 19th century scientists who first were formulating a scientific method of investigating events in the remote past, I found that they had this very practical method of reasoning that was working for them. And Darwin used it, Lyell used it, and so I found that this was there was a method of reasoning that was used in historical sciences for reconstructing causal events in the remote past. And so as I began to think about whether or not it was possible to formulate a case for intelligent design, I thought about using standard methods of scientific reasoning. The other influence that I had in this was a man named Peter Lipton, who is only, sadly, just died recently. He was the head of the History and Philosophy of Science department in Cambridge. And he was coming as a young lecturer as I was finishing my PhD research. And he had written a dissertation at Oxford on inference to the best explanation as a model of scientific reasoning, also philosophical reasoning. And in his Oxford DPhil, he wrote a critique of inference to the best explanation, raising all the objections against it, and then in his first book, postdoctorate, wrote a book answering all those objections and stating his actual position. And he provided me with a manuscript. He practiced, in a sense, what he preached, this idea of multiple competing hypotheses. And anyway, I think it's a beautiful account of a lot of scientific reasoning, certainly the kind of reasoning that goes on when you're trying to infer past causes for events in the remote past. And when we're talking about the origin of life, that's the kind of reasoning we're doing. So in making the case for intelligent design, what I've done is develop a case using this method of reasoning, this method of inferring to the best explanation. Now, to do that, you're kind of obligated to write long, fat, ponderous books because you have to take on all comers. If you're going to argue that a particular hypothesis is best, you've got to compare it to the other competing hypotheses. And so what I've done in making the case for intelligent design in Signature in the Cell is I've grouped different classes of hypotheses and analyzed their ability to explain or not the problem of the origin of information. And I've looked at hypotheses based on chance, based on natural law, and based on the combination of the two. And it turns out if you look at the history of the discussion about the origin of life, you have chemical evolutionary theories that either rely heavily on chance or on natural law, or somehow combine the two to attempt to account for the origin of biological information, the crucial thing that needs to be explained. And it turns out that each of these theories have very serious problems. And I will, in a sense, ask your forbearance to accept a very confident assertion, which is that chemical evolutionary theory is in a state of complete impasse. This is widely acknowledged even by people not known for diffidence in defending evolutionary theory, such as Richard Dawkins, and that there are fundamental problems with each of these classes of models, including the most current things like self-organizational theory and the RNA world. Okay? And the crucial problem in each case has turned out to be the problem of the origin of information. So in the book Signature in the Cell, I have a few chapters on the problem of the chance-based theories, the problem with the theories based on natural law, and theories which attempt to combine the two. What I want to do now is, I'm asking in a sense for you to take on faith, at least for the purpose of discussion now, that there are huge problems with each of those models of chemical evolutionary theory, and the problem in each case comes down to the inability to explain the origin of information. Now what I want to do is sketch the way I've turned that mere critique of chemical evolutionary theory into a positive case for intelligent design, a kind of design argument. And so I'm going to blow past the part of the talk where I typically unpack these difficulties. If you're interested in a shorter form version of that, Peter Luce's group invited me last fall to give a lecture in London, and that's now up online, I believe, on YouTube. And it's an 82-minute lecture or something like that, ridiculously long. But I go through the critique, and that's up online. Now, here's where I came to. I was a PhD student here in the late 80s. I was studying origin of life biology. I'd been exposed to some scientists in the States who had been, thinking about whether or not this information problem might be pointing in a design-friendly direction. Intuitively, we can think of information as a kind of mind product. Dawkins recognizes this with that little quote about the computer-like nature of the digital code. It's a striking appearance of design, and as you begin to think of it logically and you realize that each of these chemical evolutionary models have failed to account for it, it's at least raises a pardonable curiosity as to whether or not there might be, in fact, a positive case for intelligent design as a better explanation. And so as I began to think about this method of inference to the best explanation, defended by Darwin, developed by Peter Lipton, I began to think maybe a case for intelligent design, a rigorous case, could be developed as a scientific argument. And the method of IBE works like this. If you're trying to explain an event in the remote past, you want to posit the various possible causes that you can conceive of to explain that event. And then you want to infer that cause which, if true, would best explain the event and eliminate all other ones. In fact, the process of elimination occurs before the inference. But in any case, So this method of inference to the best explanation raised a critical question in the philosophy of science, which is, what does it mean to be best? This is one of the things that Lipton took on. And it turns out that Lipton gave an interesting account of that philosophically as essentially the best explanation provides a causal explanation that's consistent with our experience. And it turns out that the early historical scientists had come to this as a matter of practical reasoning. Lyell developed this in his Principles of Geology. And I remember one day coming across the front piece of that book, the title page, and just being hit right between the eyes by the subtitle. He says, Principles of Geology being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. That's the crucial question, or the crucial phrase. The best explanation is the one that infers a cause which, from our experience of present cause and effect, is known to have produced the effect in question. I'm from the Pacific Northwest in America. We have a state called Washington where there was a big volcanic eruption in 1980. If you go to eastern Washington, you can find volcanic ash today. Applying the method of inference to the best explanation, a geologist might come and look at that layer of ash and say, okay, how did that get here? What caused that layer of ash to get here? What are the possible causes? Might be a flood, might be an earthquake, might be a volcano. Which one is better? Which is the best? Well, obviously the volcanic eruption. Why? Because of what we know from our uniform and repeated experience of cause and effect. We've seen volcanoes produce layers of white ash. We haven't seen floods or earthquakes do the same. So encountering the effect in the absence of the ability to observe the cause, we can infer the cause based upon our knowledge of cause and effect. This was the Lyellian, Darwinian method of reasoning supporting the method of multiple competing hypotheses or inference to the best explanation. So what I did was apply this method to the question of the origin of information. One day I came across a powerful passage in a work in the application of information theory to molecular biology. And this is a quote from a pioneer in that field named Henry Quasler. He said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. For me, this triggered something very significant because what he's saying is habitually associated. He's saying we have uniform and repeated experience of agents producing intelligences producing information. This is part of our knowledge of the world around us. Okay, it's part of reality. And so as I began to think about that in light of the Lyellian method, where we're looking for causes now in operation, I asked myself the question, what is the cause now in operation for the production of functional information, for the production of digital code? And I realized that there was only one. It was intelligence. It was mind. And if you think about that, you think just from ordinary experience, we have a lot of confirmation of that. Whether it's a hieroglyphic inscription, or a section of computer code, or a headline in a newspaper, or information embedded in a radio signal, when we trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, to an intelligence, not to an undirected material process. So in other words, there is a cause in operation of which we know that can account, that does produce the kind of information that we find in living systems. So if we look at the information in DNA, we realize that whenever we find information and we trace it back to its source, we always come to an intelligence. It's possible to infer a prior intelligence as the best explanation for the information in the ultimate information in DNA. And this is the case that I've developed in Signature in the Cell. The sketch that I made of the argument today focuses on the key thing that needs to be explained, the information, but in the Signature in the Cell, I look at the competing explanations and show why they are deficient. The other thing is that in Signature in the Cell, here's in a sense a sketch of the argument. If the crucial explanandum is specified complexity or functional information, and we examine carefully the models that have been proposed to explain that, we find that neither chance nor law-like necessity nor the combination of the two has succeeded. Only intelligence is capable of producing that kind of information based on our experience. The other thing I would say is that in making the case today, I've simply described it by reference to what you might call molecular biology 101, the very basic facts of molecular biology that have remained unexplained since the 1960s by all theories of the origin of life, all chemical evolutionary theories. But I've just given a sketch of the very basic facts of molecular biology. New things are being discovered, especially in genomics, that I think heighten the case for intelligent design, that intensify it and strengthen it. We have a computer programmer, a Microsoft architect who works closely with the molecular biologists in our lab in Seattle. And one day he came into my office and tossed a book on my table called Design Patterns. And he said very dramatically, "I get an eerie feeling that someone has figured this out before us." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he'd been working on writing code to help simulate this gene expression system that I showed in the animation. And he said, well, as I'm learning more about molecular biology and then having to represent that in code, how the cell processes information, he says, I'm really blown away, because what I'm finding is that the cell is using the same design patterns that we use in modern digital computing. Then he explained to me that a design pattern is an established design strategy, a way of processing, in particular, in this case, digital information. And he said, inside the cell, we have there's an operating system. What we used to think of as the junk DNA is actually functioning as an operating system, operating on the data files, the digital files. There's automated error correction. There is a files within folders, hierarchical filing system for the information. Same kind of logic as the way we store information on a desktop. There's distributed storage and retrieval of information, and where the cell goes out, finds modules, concatenates them on a need basis, and produces a completely novel protein. And then there's nested coding of information. He went on and on about these sophisticated methods of processing information that are known from one and only one realm of experience, and that is the realm of design engineering, computer software design engineering. So when we think about, again, we're trying to infer to the best explanation based on our knowledge of cause and effect, we have a number of specific features of the information processing system that map to one and only one type of cause. And that, again, the cause is agency or intelligence or mind. So the case for intelligent design can be made very strong. One last point, since it's a conference about the design argument. The argument from analogy that Hume was said to have refuted. Okay, first point is that the case, Darwin got rid of ID because he claimed to have a better explanation for the design-like features of living organisms. What I'm arguing now today is that he did not. That there's a crucial design-like feature of living organisms, namely digital information in cells, that neither Darwinism nor the chemical evolutionary theories, which were designed to complement Darwin's theory, have accounted for. Okay, so the better explanation case against design, I think, is being refuted by these new developments in molecular biology. The other case against the design argument came from Hume, which was the claim that the design argument was a failed analogy. And what he did is he said, look, you've got, the structure of an analogical argument is that you've got two similar effects with a known cause, allowing us to infer a similar cause for the other effect. That's the logical structure of an analogical argument. Hume attempted to defeat that by showing that the similarity between effect E1, human artifacts, and effect E2, living systems, was much less than had been previously indicated. The structure of the argument that I've developed and that other people in the ID research community are developing is not an analogical argument, properly speaking. We're not arguing from similarities of effect. Rather, what we're doing is picking out identical effects in both living systems and artifactual systems, in particular specified complexity, which can be very rigorously defined, and saying, okay, we're looking at identical effects. Now, what is the best causal explanation of that effect given our knowledge of cause and effect? So the argument does not have the logical structure of an analogical argument of the kind that Hume critiqued, but rather of an inference to the best explanation, a standard scientific form of argumentation. And so the case I've made is that cause for intelligence provides a better explanation because it's the only cause which is consistent with our knowledge of cause and effect as we observe it in the world around us, as we observe the causes now in operation. So in closing, I don't think Darwin refuted the design argument. I think it's back on the table, and I'm eager to converse about all of the different implications that might have for philosophy, theology, and science itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Meyer. Comments and questions, please?
Yeah, Professor Josephson. Yeah.
an objection, but not a fatal one, to your line of argument, which is that you can, if you simply say generation of information, then there are, say, algorithms which do this. But the real question is whether they can generate the kind of information you talked about in your last slide, and that's I think you could argue that that would be much more difficult to account for. You would run into the same objections as other people's approaches.
Right, right. You have the concept of Kolmogorov information and the idea of compressibility. An algorithm would a couple things. First of all, the algorithm itself would generate could generate some information, but usually it's information that's already embedded in the algorithm itself. And the origin of that information is where we'd place the locus of design. It's not what the algorithm generates subsequent to its existence. It's the design of the algorithm itself. So
well,
there's
algorithms can get outside their own box, but aren't good enough.
Aren't good enough. No, yeah, we have something. We sometimes call it the Dembski threshold because of the book that the mathematician William Dembski wrote. There are within, for example, in biological evolutionary theory, there's a certain amount of information that is accessible because of the probabilistic resources of a given system. But we think that there's definable limits to that, and so I go through that in the argument about chance itself. And we say that the amount of information in a protein, for example, it vastly exceeds the available probabilistic resources of the naturalistic environment. So, yes?
Intelligent design doesn't offer an alternative mechanism to evolution. That's one of the arguments against it, and one of the reasons why people consider it to be creationism. Are you interested in an alternative mechanism? And if so, if yes, I have another question.
Okay. Well, in a sense, what we're offering is an alternative type of cause. And that the essential requirement of explanation is not that you provide a mechanistic cause, a material cause, but rather a cause known to be sufficient from experience. And so we conceive of that as mind by reference to our own knowledge, our own introspective knowledge of what we as minds can do. So in a sense, the question of mechanism is a question-begging objection in that we're challenging materialistic explanations, the sufficiency of materialistic explanations, by proposing a mental or immaterial cause, namely the kind of cause that we know from experience that mind can produce.
But aren't you looking for, I mean, isn't the idea of it being intelligence that there's an intelligent process to evolution? The intelligent design argument against the mechanisms of mutation and selection is insufficient. So certainly you'd be looking for another mechanism. The reason why I ask is because I lived in Hong Kong in 1985, and I heard a mechanism then of evolution. It explained evolution as a process of development in nature. In other words, it was a cyclical process that both created and it created life from raw materials until its final form. It's a wonderful cyclical process. It's self-propagating, self-perpetuating, and self-renewing, like how nature develops life, building up and breaking down. And the mechanisms are simple. It's only rotation and differentiation. I'm not going to explain it to you. I'm not taking that. But it is a wonderful process. And I heard it 25 years ago, and it makes predictions. It's a material process. And it also implies intelligence. The way the birth of a baby, from conception to gestation till a baby's first cry, for the faithful, it's a clear indication of God's wondrous hand, and for the non-faithful, it's the intelligibility and coherence of nature.
So would you like to answer the?
Yeah, sure. Well, okay. The question is, are we looking for an intelligent process? And I think there would be some people that would say, well, maybe there's a kind of intelligence imbued in nature. But what I'm interested in is the origin of the ultimate origin of information. There's a scientist at the University of Chicago named James Shapiro that's become a staunch Darwinian critic. He's a leading cell biologist at Chicago. And what he's noticing is there is something in the cell called processes under algorithmic control of pre-programmed adaptive capacity. And he recently gave a talk with Michael Behe, also opposite, and they were talking about their different perspectives. And Shapiro was mapping how this pre-programmed adaptive capacity works. He's not an ID proponent, but Behe, being an ID proponent, says, well, what we're interested in is the ultimate origin of that pre-programmed adaptive capacity, the algorithms in the first place. And so my argument is that from information you can detect retrospectively the activity of mind, of intelligence, of conscious activity, and that may or may not have a material instantiation. I'm a theist, so I ultimately think that the design case leads to a theistic design hypothesis, although the case that I'm making today just gets you to design simplicity, or to some kind of mind, okay? So, and I don't feel the force. What we're trying to do in the idea research community is to get scientists to see that agency, mind, conscious activity is a part of reality. It's part of the cause and effect structure of the world. It plays a role in the cause and effect structure of the world. So we don't have to put sort of 19th century materialistic blinders on and say, we can't consider that as a possible cause. So whether there are intelligent processes where the matter is somehow imbued with intelligence or not, I'm not commenting on that. What I am arguing is that certain kinds of effects require certain kinds of causes based on our experience. And the explanandum, the effect of information, points to not a material cause, not a mechanistic cause, but a mental or conscious cause, a cause of mind, which I take to be a real causal entity, something that has real causal powers, which I know, if for no other reasons, from my own introspective experience of being a quasi-intelligent designer. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, I haven't got the answer to my question, but as I mentioned to you, I'm trying to write a book about this, and the thing that comes up for me again and again is that I don't think anything in biology can make sense, or will fully make sense, until we restore to our understanding some concept of, we can use different words if the old words are embarrassing, but some concept of life force. I mean, you used to sort of say, and people say, oh, not vitalism, you know, and they sort of do that. And so I just don't think, because yes, the information, but as I watch that animation, there's movement going on. There's something happening all the time. I mean, right now in your body, there are literally trillions of operations happening right now as you're standing there. And supposedly this is just a sort of chemical reaction being driven by sunlight, essentially. That's a materialistic view, so I think we have to bring the life force back. I know it's not what we're talking about.
Well, actually, I have a colleague, Richard Sternberg. Oh, yes, he's saying, he's arguing that we need to bring back some notion of a vitalistic life force, that there's something more than just the mechanistic, even in not just in the origin of life, but in its present workings. Right. And I have a colleague who's developing a place where you find the most sympathy for that idea is among developmental biologists, because you have these points in the development of organisms where suddenly the cells and the protein morphogens inside the cells that are responsible for development just seem to, it's like a marching band. They all seem to know where they're supposed to go. And a number of developmental biologists are sympathetic to the idea that there are infusions of information that are necessary just to get development to work properly, that more than can be quantified in either the DNA or the cell structures. So I'll tell you a little bit about some of those folks and direct you to some of their work, but it's an interesting idea, a powerful new direction. It's very anti-materialistic. Yes?
As you said, for Darwin, the origin of life wasn't really a problem because they basically believed in the spontaneous generation of life around about that period. But the question for me is that the gaps from what you said and from what I've read seem to be getting bigger and bigger all the time. And I, for the life of me, can't understand why the majority of scientists can't actually see that Darwinism or neo-Darwinism doesn't work in the areas that you
I think that I'll mention this by, yes, he's saying that since the 19th century, the gaps, the problems with accounting for either the origin of life or the origin of new forms of life have been getting bigger and bigger. The problems with the standard evolutionary theories are more acute, not less. And so he can't see why more scientists aren't open to ID, perhaps, and certainly critical of Darwinism. And I would say that the reason there is primarily philosophical and methodological. I wonder if I have a slide still open, but there's a convention in science that is regarded, really, and really only since Darwin's time, called methodological naturalism, and it's regarded by many scientists to be a kind of normative convention of scientific reasoning, which, and the convention runs like this. It says if you're going to be a scientist, properly speaking, you have to limit yourself to explain things by reference to chance and necessity, by reference to material processes. That was the famous title of Jacques Monod's book, Chance and Necessity. That's what scientists do. They explain things by reference to purely materialistic explanations, by reference to mechanisms and nothing more. But there's a missing category there. We explain all kinds of things by reference to agency. And yet that type of explanation is excluded from consideration in science. And so what happens in the dialectic of these evolutionary theories is that you'll have fashions. And people will cycle through the same kinds of explanations over and over again, all the while missing the kind of elephant in the room. And so there's been a period in origin of life studies where chance predominated in the 50s. Then you got explanations called self-organizational explanations in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now we have an explanation that's been proposed, RNA world, that combines the two. That's now failing. People are saying we need a pre-RNA world, and they're going back to the self-organization necessity node. And they cycle through over and over again, but they continue to encounter the same problems. In fact, we call it the displacement problem, where every attempt to explain the origin of information, absent an intelligent agent, either fails or it surreptitiously smuggles in the effect of intelligent agency. In the RNA world scenario, one of the big problems with it was that you couldn't get anywhere unless you did what was called ribozyme engineering, where you literally had the experimenter designing RNA sequences in hopes that they could get a little bit of self-replication capacity. So the information problem, you sweep it under one rug and then it pops out under another. You know, it just doesn't go away. So, and I think that is a byproduct of this artificial restriction on reasoning that excludes the reality of something of which we all know, which is mind. Agency has certain causal powers that nature itself, by itself, does not have. And when we encounter effects that we know only agents can produce, it is rational to infer the activity of agency, not to exclude it on principle and say, well, we must be scientific. One of the points that my colleague Steve Fuller has made, who's speaking next, is that design and teleology were part of the structure of scientific reasoning from the beginning. And this recent period of time, last 100 years or so, or 150 years or so, represents a kind of detour from the program of the scientific revolution, which was based on the idea of intelligibility, of design built into nature, which we could pursue. And so he sees the ID movement in some ways as bringing that back, and therefore having heuristic benefits for science. So,
thank you. We've got another question here.
Very good.
Waiting for some time.
Stephen, I've been intrigued by the absence of any credible alternative explanation to the origin of information. Richard Dawkins in the clip we almost saw says it could be aliens. Professor Peter Atkins in his book says it's not real information, it just looks like information as we look at it now. But there seems to be a view that we're supposed to live in a multiverse, and that explains it, because anything that's conceivably possible is bound to have happened somewhere. Would you like to comment on that?
Oh, I think that's most certainly true.
Just repeat.
Yes, he's asking about whether the multiverse might be able to account for the origin of information, and also some people who have, Peter Atkins, who's objected to the idea that the information that you find in DNA is not real information, it's just chemistry. I had a little riff with him on, I think it was BBC4 one time, about that, and there's a little debate clip up on YouTube, maybe we could find that. But one of the reasons I belabored the point in the presentation about the information in DNA being functional or functionally specified information or specified complexity, and that understanding of information is not idiosyncratic to the ID movement, but it has developed naturally out of an analysis of what's going on in the cell by people who are trying to explain the origin of life, even from within a materialistic framework, is to emphasize the point that the definition or the type of information that needs to be explained that we're talking about when we develop these cases for design, or my argument for design, is not idiosyncratic. It's an accepted standard understanding of information. So I had a good debate with Atkins about that on the radio, and I don't think his point follows. As for the multiverse, I think this is a very interesting. Typically, people think that the fine-tuning of the laws of physics and chemistry might point in one of two directions, and it's essentially a wash. You might explain, and for those, the fine-tuning is the idea that the basic laws and constants of physics, as well as the initial conditions, have very precise either configurations in the case of the initial conditions or quantitative values in the case of the laws and constants of physics, and that that the fine-tuning of those features of the universe is a necessary condition of there being life at all. And Hoyle and others, as they began to discover these in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, I think there's something like 3 dozen of these really crucial fine-tuning parameters. And many physicists began to consider the possibility that in physics we were seeing evidence of design. The current contrary or counter argument is, well, actually the fine-tuning of our universe is an inevitable artifact or byproduct of the existence of multiple universes. So many, in fact, that our universe is a universe with the parameters that are necessary to life would be bound to arise somewhere. So it's in a sense an inflation of all the probabilistic resources. There's so many universes that our universe or a universe like ours is rendered probable somewhere. Okay, and so typically now in the discussion, people tend to think the ID case or the multiverse is essentially a wash when it comes to cosmological fine-tuning. I disagree with that for a couple of reasons. In fact, I think there are strong reasons to prefer a theistic design hypothesis for the fine-tuning. And I just, if you don't mind, would like to pull up one slide that will underscore or support my answer. Some of you may be familiar with the wonderful illustration that John Polkinghorne has given of the fine-tuning as imagining yourself coming into the cosmic control room, and you have all these dials and knobs, and each one is set with a very precise quantitative value. And because you're a physicist, you whip the pencil out from behind your ear and you begin to make some calculations, and you realize that if you changed the setting of the gravitational force constant or the nuclear force constant or the ratio of fundamental forces or the speed of light or the expansion rate of the universe or any of these fundamental parameters, something would happen in the universe that would make life impossible. That's the phenomenon that needs to be explained. Hoyle said a common sense interpretation of that suggested a super intellect had monkeyed with physics to make life possible. I always like the way the monkeys get into the origins debates, even when it's in physics. Okay. But here's my take as to why the multiverse does not provide a better explanation than design. I think there's strong reasons to prefer the theistic design hypothesis for the fine-tuning over and against the multiverse. In order to explain there are 2 forms of fine-tuning that have to be explained. There's the fine-tuning of the initial conditions, and there's the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics. In the context of physics, when you to come up with the multiverses, you have to have some kind of universe-generating mechanism. And 2 of them have been proposed. One is string theory, and one is the inflationary cosmology. And it turns out that inflation could, in principle, or could possibly explain the fine-tuning of the initial conditions, but not the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of physics. To explain the laws and constants of physics, you would need to invoke the string theoretic landscape. And so you've got 2 speculative cosmologies necessary to explain 2 different parts of the fine-tuning. As a result of that, you have to invoke a number of pure theoretical posits, pure theoretical postulations, to explain what the single postulation of theistic design explains simply and coherently in a way that's consistent with our experience of what designers do. And I have a colleague who works in the philosophy of physics who's developed this slide. It's called 6 Credulous Conjectures Before Breakfast. That is to say, if you're going to explain the fine-tuning with the multiverse, you have to first of all accept 2 speculative postulates from the inflationary cosmology. That first of all, that inflaton fields exist, and that inflation is eternal and into the future. You also have to accept that there is the shutoff energy of the inflaton field is finely tuned. Both of the speculative cosmologies necessary to explain the fine-tuning have the problem that they require prior fine-tuning to generate universes like ours. So they actually don't get rid of the fine-tuning ultimately, which is another problem with them. You also have to accept the existence of strings and that they are the fundamental constituents of matter, of material reality. You have to accept that there are 6 or 7 dimensions of space, that all the different compactifications of these extra hidden dimensions are instantiated in different universes that actually exist, that there are enough of them to account for the universe or the fine-tuning that we have, and that the probabilistic resources constructed from inflaton fields and the string landscape are sufficient to explain away the fine-tuning of the initial conditions, laws, and constants. In other words, there are enough possible universes to account for this. None of these 6 postulates is clear. It's not clear how you relate these 2 speculative cosmologies, if they can be related in an internally coherent way. And both of them, as I said, presuppose prior fine-tuning. So when you add all that up, I think there are really strong reasons to prefer the theistic design hypothesis over the multiverse. And I list the main problems. And the third one that I haven't talked about is that in the case of theistic design, it represents a natural extrapolation from our knowledge of cause and effect, where we know what agents can do, we know how they can finely tune things to produce a functional outcome. We really have no experiential knowledge of things like inflaton fields and all these things that are essentially pure theoretical posits. So I think there's some strong reasons to prefer the design hypothesis over the multiverse. And the thing I would say about, one last thing I'd say about that is that the case for design from biology leaves you with design simplicity. Or it could be a mind of any kind, an immanent intelligence or a transcendent intelligence. I'm a theist, and I think that if you couple the design argument in biology with the design argument in physics, and also with some of the things that a reformulated cosmological argument, I think you can make a very strong theistic case, a theistic design argument, but you need to bring in facts from relevant disciplines beyond biology to make that case. So
the time just for one
more.
final
sorry for such a long
brief
answer.
question. Yeah.
Yeah, James. Yeah. Dr. Lefanu. Yes.
This might be a terribly simple question. I was wondering if you could just make that distinction between what is the difference between the chance and the necessity arguments for studying origin of life.
Right. The chance view is here. I got. Right. He's asked me to explain the difference between chance and necessity. This is the critical part of my talk, which I gutted in interest of time. Okay. So if you go back to Monod's book in 1968, he says there's 2 basic explanation strategies that scientists can invoke. One is random, stochastic, non-law-like, non-repetitive processes. So if you think in the origin of life in the 50s, when people first began to think of it and realized that we were dealing with digital code, the idea was, well, essentially you could have random interactions in the prebiotic soup that would be, by analogy, something like pulling Scrabble letters out of a bag and getting the letters to line up properly, just by chance. There was no physical law of any kind, no chemical attractions that caused certain arrangements, but it was just a matter of pure unguided, undirected chance processes. If you got enough trials, eventually you would hit on the correct sequence. In the book, I explain why almost all, I would say, I can't think of a single exception to this. All serious origin of life researchers have rejected that idea. And it essentially comes down to the problem of what's called, it's the problem of combinatorials that, you have a little puzzle here, 4 dials, 6 sides, that's 6 times 6 times 6 times 6 possibilities, 1,296 possibilities, okay? It is possible that in one try I might get that, but if I think about the number of possibilities that have to be searched to get a reasonable chance of generating the correct combination where all the dinosaurs line up with the head, the body, the tail, and the label, it's much more likely than not that I will not accomplish that by chance than that I will accomplish it by chance. So if we're looking for the best explanation, we don't want a hypothesis which is much more likely to be false than true. And in the case of the combinatorial search space, it's not 1,296 possibilities with proteins. Even a modest protein, 150 amino acids in length, the 20 possibilities at each one in a very nicely rarefied prebiotic soup. You've got 20 times 20 times 20 to the 150th power. Even taking into account what we know about the variability that's allowed at certain sites, you have these enormous combinatorial spaces that have to be searched. And it turns out, and the book bears the burden of the mathematical proof of this, that if every event from the beginning of the universe was devoted to searching the space of possible amino acid combinations, where an event is defined as a minimal interaction between 2 elementary particles, I mean, a ridiculously absurd definition of an event. If every event were devoted to searching the space of possible amino acid combinations, you would not search more than 1/10 trillionth of the space of possible ways of arranging them. So given the resources you have, it's always going to be much more likely than not that chance will fail.
And Dr. Meyer, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.